Okay, I think we are starting. Hi, my name is Mariel, and I have a talk for you guys today called Back to Basics, 2D Animation for Games. So, I am lead animator and art director at Lab Zero Games. I worked on Skullgirls, and now I'm working on our next game called Indivisible. Our games are 2D hand-animated games, so that's where my experience lies. But I think what I have here today should help anyone looking to animate in games. So I'm kind of hoping that not everyone here is a super experienced industry animator. Like, I know all you guys are, but maybe not the stream. And some of you guys are just animator babies, because what I'd like to cover today are some super, super basics. And I think even if you are experienced, it's always fun and important to kind of revisit your foundations. So, I assume that we've all heard of the 12 principles of animation, right? It was introduced by longtime Disney animators Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas, two of Disney's 9 old men, in an effort to solidly define some of the principles that make for solid animation in their book, The Illusion of Life. It's an incredibly important part of animation that really defines the core of how we all approach how to animate. If you've ever taken an animation class, you've very likely learned all these. But what I'd like to talk about today is not just to go down the list and talk about each principle. You can get The Illusion of Life, or you can just read about it on Wikipedia or whatever. But instead, go over these principles and in what ways they actually apply to game animation. So let's start. First, we have squash and stretch. So I think even if you know next to nothing about animation, you've probably heard of squash and stretch. It's basically the first thing you're ever taught in an animation class. But for the sake of clarity, let's go over it really quickly. Squash and stretch is a way to give your animation a sense of flexibility and weight. It's taking your subject and, quite literally, stretching or squashing the form, exaggerating it to make a motion feel more convincing. It's important to note that it's just as important in 3D as it is in 2D. Squash and stretch is just as important in game animation also. It's what's going to help you push your animation and give it that extra bit of weight or speed that really sells what's happening in your game. But I also think that squash and stretch can actually be a little bit tricky in games, because what the game is going to do with your animation or how it's going to play your animation is up to the game and not the animator. So I think you actually have to be a little bit smart, or at least aware of how you use it. For example, in our games, we utilize something called hit stop, which is where the game holds frames of animation longer, just a beat longer on an impact to make that impact feel stronger. Is the animation playing? Yes. A lot of fighting games use this, especially 2D ones, and I've noticed that Platinum games, and I think like CyberConnect, does it as well. There's actually a really good post online by the designer of Smash Brothers, Sakurai, that he just kind of breaks down in what ways Smash Brothers uses hit stop. And I can't link it here because this is a presentation, but if you look up Sakurai hit stop, you can find a link to the interview. That's unrelated. So anyways, hit stop basically pauses the game at the point of impact. So that actually means that you should be generally aware of what frame is potentially going to stop. If it's a super squashed or stretched frame, or something otherwise really exaggerated, it can kind of look weird. And you probably don't want hit stop to happen on any of these weird frames. So you definitely need to find a balance between great animation and your poses with an awareness of which of those frames could be seen more. Second, we have anticipation. Anticipation is the motion you make before you make a motion. It's what lets the audience know that something's about to happen. It's the wind-up before a punch. It's the bending of your knees before you jump. It's the lifting of your shoulders in the chest before you exhale. So this is a huge principle in games. Apart from being the core part of making any motion, in games it serves the specific purpose of telling the player what's about to happen in the game. So when an enemy is about to hit you, it needs to signal to the player that they need to react. That's the anticipation. So when this player sees the enemy doing a big windup, she'll know to dodge or block or counter or whatever. Even if it's short, having an anticipation in your animations gives that sense of contrast that really helps push the animation and communicate what's happening. So if you've seen my talks before, I kind of have talked about how you always need anticipation, but I think there are a few cases where you don't. So I want to go over those really quick. A basic one is that you probably don't want any anticipation going into your basic movement. It's pretty unsatisfying, I feel, if you want to move forward and you have to wait a beat for your character to actually start moving. You definitely can have a slow start to a movement that builds up into a constant pace, but you probably don't want to have actual anticipation before movement unless it's something very specific like a build-up before a huge dash. And then in Skullgirls, we animated all our characters with 2 frames of startup in their jumps. So from the idle, they have 2 frames of anticipation before rising into the air. And then when we started making Indivisible, which is a platforming RPG, and we started animating Ajna in the same way as Skullgirls. So we had just basically the same jump animation. But as we play tested it, we actually found that those 2 frames of startup that we had in Skullgirls made for an unsatisfying delay before jumping in a platformer. So we ended up cutting it entirely and just having Ajna go straight from standing to rising in the air. It actually was cutting that anticipation that made it feel more satisfying to play. My thing's not going. There it goes. So, to sum up, in games, you need anticipation, but also maybe you don't. I don't know. It just depends on what you're doing. But I think the thing that's important to remember here is that having an awareness of it and knowing what you need to do with it and what it's going to be used for is a really essential part of communicating your gameplay. Next, we have staging. In The Illusion of Life, staging refers to the presentation of your idea so that it's as clear as possible, whatever that idea is. Whether it's color, composition, light, camera angle, it's all about making sure that your idea is coming across clearly. For games, this is likely outside of the animator's control, and I know that's something that's been touched on in the talks today. The staging of the game is going to be set up by the game itself. Instead, the staging of the game will actually impact the way you animate. So you need to be aware of the kind of game you're animating, and you have to be able to animate to play to that camera. If you're animating a platformer or an isometric game or an FPS or anything else, you need to make sure your animation is as clear as possible, and that may mean approaching it in different ways. For example, if you're making a platformer, you're going to be looking at the characters from the side, so it's pretty easy to get really striking poses and silhouettes. But if you're making a game view from the top down, those same poses may not read in the same way, so you'll have to tweak your poses, even if it's slight, like this example here. It's all about being aware of how the player is going to be viewing your animation and adjusting it accordingly. Next, we have straight-ahead action and pose-to-pose. Both of these terms originated in 2D animation. They refer to the methods the animator uses to animate a motion. When you animate in 2D, you can basically approach it in 2 ways. Straight ahead is when you start from the beginning and you draw every frame in order, kind of winging it as you go. And pose to pose is when you draw the key poses first, and once you have that figured out, you go back and then you add the in-betweens. So I found that in our games, there's really nothing more important than getting good, strong keys in. So that kind of lends my approach to being pose to pose. What we used to do that we don't do anymore, but I still think is a very effective approach to game animation, is to actually only animate the keys first and get those in-game as soon as you can. That way, you can time things out and make sure your game feels good before going back in and adding your in-betweens. The purpose of game animation is explicitly to communicate the gameplay, so you need to animate around your gameplay and not create your gameplay around your animation. So by timing out only the bare minimum animation to get your gameplay to feel right, and then fleshing out the in-betweens later, you can potentially save yourself a lot of unnecessary work. If you follow the development of Bayonetta, they actually blogged about it, a lot of their process on the Platinum Games site. There wasn't supposed to be sound here, but I guess it's okay. In particular, they posted this early prototype where they basically did just this. The animation is super unpolished, and in a lot of places, it's just hitting the main poses it needs to convey the gameplay. But that's all you need to start. What comes first in making a game is to make the game. You don't need to make beautiful art or animation or the music. You just need to get whatever the game needs at its core working first. And I did mention at Lab Zero, I think I'm covering the mic, we don't do it this way anymore, but it's only because we've done it for so long that we generally have an idea of what we need to do. But I think that if you're figuring out your gameplay for the first time, it can be a really useful way to test things very quickly. On things that don't need to be animated or timed to the gameplay though, like a dust effect after a character lands from a jump, or anything like that, you can animate straight ahead. Again, things like effects that lend themselves to being very organic and free-flowing benefit from being animated straight ahead. And I actually find it very difficult to animate effects pose to pose because effects kind of just happen in a way, but I'm also really bad at animating effects. Now we have follow through and overlapping action, which is kind of one of my favorites. I don't know if it's lame to have a favorite principle, but there it is. So these are actually two different things, and I think they often get confused with secondary action, because I know I used to confuse them a little bit. And it's in part because they're all very closely related, so let's go over them. Follow-through refers to the motion made by things that will continue to move after the source of the motion has stopped. Basically, things don't all stop moving at once, or more technically, it's inertia, the principle that states objects will continue their state of rest or motion until acted upon by an external force. If you have a cape or loose clothing, hair, long ears, fat, anything like that, after you stop moving, these things don't stop right there with you. They will continue to move until they are pulled back or gradually come to rest. It doesn't have to mean just flappy things, though. It can also refer to follow through in your body as well. For example, if you move your elbow around, like this, I'm going to do it, your hand and your fingers will follow that motion that starts at your elbow. Overlapping action is that objects move at different rates, overlapping each other. When you walk, your legs and arms don't make the same motion, and they don't move at the same speed. Depending on how you're walking, your arms might move faster or slower than your legs, and that applies to anything. In games, follow-through is super helpful. A lot of times, your animations need to move quickly or be spaced very widely to travel a large distance. In 2D animation, you only have so many frames to do that, so follow-through can be a really useful tool to help cover a large distance traveled. If you've seen my talks before, I've used this example before, but I still think it's really relevant. In this animation of Big Band, we really wanted to sell the sense of impact in this stomp, and the way it seemed to work best was to just not have any in-betweens between the extremes. So if you look at just his body, it definitely looks choppy because there's nothing in between those two keys. But that's where the follow-through comes in. Adding the delayed fluttering of his coat helped fill in the motion that was missing because that motion still follows the same path, it's just delayed. Now we have slow in and slow out. I'm just kind of really running through these. So the idea behind this one is pretty simple. It relates pretty closely to timing. Slowing in refers to a slow start to a motion, and slowing out refers to a slow end to a motion. If I move my arm doesn't move at a constant speed throughout the entire motion. It starts slow, it picks up speed, and then it slows to an ending position. You do this by choosing where to place your frames on the overall path of the motion, whether it's more at the start or at the end. So in games, this can actually be a little bit tricky. Playing sound again. Oh well. If game animation were one continuous motion like a film, there'd be no problem. But the thing about games, I'm going to turn the sound off because I don't want to hear it, is that the animation is not one continuous thing. The game is picking from a bunch of different animations and playing them next to each other, often even interrupting one motion to cut to the next. I find that it doesn't make a huge impact on the way I animate the bulk of my moves, but it does impact how I return or handle the return to idle sometimes. Oh, it's playing sound because I switched to Keynote afterwards. That's why. Oh well. So when we animate, we start most every motion with the idle pose, animate the intended action, and then return back to the idle pose afterwards. So when you're looking at just one of our animations, it looks like the left example where we have a single frame of the idle as the starting and ending point. But one thing you have to remember is that the idle isn't just that one frame. The idle itself is also a motion. So if you slow in and slow out of that one idle frame, the motion going between the two is going to look smooth when you're just looking at that, depending on what the idle is. But you actually need to take into account what the motion the idle is making in order to animate into that and smooth the whole thing out. And now we have arc. I kind of wish this was earlier in the list, but I'm just going down the order it's listed in the 12 principles, so oh well. So, simply put, objects in motion follow a path. They don't just jerk all over the place. Think of an animating bouncing ball think of the animated bouncing ball exercise. The path that ball follows is your arc. Different things follow different arcs. You can take a walk, for example, that kind of has an example here. Both your hands and feet move on different paths. Pretty much any natural, non-mechanical motion follows an arc. So for games, arcs can be done two ways, I guess. So one is where you design the arc in the animation, and the other, probably more likely way, is that the arc is determined by the game itself. So let's go back to these jumps. This is what we actually animate. And it's not actually a jump we're animating. We just draw a bunch of the frames that are going to be turned into the jump. What you have to do as an animator, though, is anticipate what the game is going to do with your animation and work with that in mind. We have to work with our designers really closely to know and understand in what ways our animation is going to be used. It's absolutely essential for animators to work so close with design because animation is what's going to convey their design. So, of course, when you're animating, you can always just try to approximate what the game will do. In the case of jumps, you can always move your frames to see if the motion will generally work. But you do have to keep in mind that a lot of it will change when it actually gets in game, and you can't take into account every case. So that's why understanding how it's supposed to be used is really important. So let's come back to secondary motion, which I mentioned just a second ago. So think of a walk again. When you're walking, your legs and hips are definitely making a walking motion. But what are your hands doing? Are they swinging? Are they in your pockets? Are they folded up? These are all examples of what a secondary motion might be, which is a motion, quite literally, that is secondary to the main one happening that enriches the main action. So in games, while secondary motions do enrich your overall animation, you need to make sure that they're not also taking away from the point you're trying to make. I think it's true of any animation, but in my experience in games, what matters most is to be as clear as possible. And I've found that sometimes the clarity in my animation is helped by removing motions and paring things down. motions that could be interpreted as distracting in any way. So as much as it might be nice to add an extra flourish onto your animation, you need to decide how much it'll really add to the overall game experience. I think game animations benefit most from being simple, clear, and straightforward. When there's a bunch of enemies swarming you and there's visual effects on top and everything's happening at once, the last thing you really need to be animating is a ton of secondaries that's going to distract from the overall point of your animation. Keep it simple, stupid, etc. So, timing is pretty straightforward. Timing refers to the number of frames used to convey a given action. When used well, it's a big part of what makes a motion look convincing. So let's go back to the bouncing ball. A bouncy ball might have less frames of animation because it moves very quickly, and a bowling ball might have more because it's heavier. Also related to timing is spacing, which is where the object is located on a given frame. Effective spacing is the difference between smooth animation and jittery animation, so it's an especially important principle to take note of. In games,
to level up. Characters could level up by gaining experience either by defeating one of the bosses, by collecting the gems that they can pick up throughout the match, or by completing the generous bonus stages.
So in games, timing is everything when it comes to gameplay.
An obvious
the
nod to
timing
Street
is
Fighter
what the
2,
game
they started
needs
to level
to
up. Characters
be
could
the
level
game
up
it
by
is.
gaining experience
And
either by
that's what's
defeating
going
one of the bosses, by
determine
collecting
how
the
your
gems
animation
that they
is going to
can
be
pick up throughout
timed.
the match, or by completing
As
the
much
generous
as we'd
bonus
like
stages.
to animate a jump with like this big anticipation and a big dramatic landing,
obvious nod
or
to
a
Street
punch
Fighter
with
2,
a huge
they
dramatic
started to level
wind-up,
up.
it's not going to
Characters
do
could
your
level
game
up
any
by gaining
good if it
experience
doesn't
either
work
by
with
defeating
how
one
the
of the
game needs to
bosses,
play.
by collecting the gems that they can.
Shut up. So, to go back to the point about getting stuff in game first, do that first. It's what's going to determine your timing. And then, honestly, I think a lot of the hard part is figured out. Once you have the timing, you can break that down and figure out how many in-betweens you need to add. Animation doesn't have to be fighting against the design or making compromises in your animation to make it work in the game. The gameplay does take priority no matter what, but your animation doesn't need to suffer for it. It's all about understanding what the game needs and then working with that, breaking that down, and then using that to get the best animation you can. And I have another favorite one. Sorry, it's exaggeration. So exaggeration is basically what it sounds like. You take whatever it is and you exaggerate it, whether it's how you're pushing the drawing, whether you're pushing the motion of the animation, or anything. Lots of exaggeration can result in a very cartoony look. Subtle exaggeration can lead to a more realistic. There's no rule per se, it just kind of depends on the effect you want to achieve. In any case, using exaggeration effectively can really help sell the idea you want to convey. So this is also a big one for the way I like to animate. Obviously, you don't want to exaggerate everything, because if everything is exaggerated, there's no contrast. But the right amount of exaggeration is the difference between decent animation and great animation, I feel. Exaggeration is important because what it's about at its core is readability. So whatever you're animating, take a step back and think, is there a way I can push this more? Is there a way I can make it clearer? You can also exaggerate by actually pushing the size and shapes of things. In the Smash Brothers clip, Mario's hand actually gets bigger at the apex of that punch. And in this compilation of spiral standing attacks from Marvel vs. Capcom, there's obviously a lot of exaggeration in general, but most notably in her kicks, where you can actually see her fur thingy get bigger. All of these things contribute to the readability without looking out of place. So, in 2D animation, solid drawing is particularly important, though I think the understanding behind it still applies to 3D too. Basically, I think to be a good 2D animator, you have to have a really great foundation in art. I think that means you need to understand the three-dimensionality of shapes, you understand anatomy, weight, balance, just everything. Having a thorough foundation, or having a thorough understanding of these foundations, means that you can apply them in your animation, which leads to a more convincing motion. And I think what helps the most in regards to character animation is taking life drawing classes. They probably seem boring. They kind of are, except I also like them a little bit. But they're really an essential part of learning how to convey motion, rest, weight, balance, which are all core parts of animation. This isn't really game related, I guess, but it does apply in just as much in game animation as it does in any other kind of animation. And finally, we have our last principle, appeal. So I think this is important to define because it does refer to visual appeal, that is, the designs and the acting, but there's also more to it. Appeal in animation can also be likened to charisma in an actor. It's that kind of undefinable quality that makes them compelling. Both heroes and villains, protagonists and antagonists can have appeal. And so it can take many forms, like I just picked out a couple examples. Straight up, I don't know how this specifically applies to games, except in the sense that it applies to everything ever. So whether it's a book, a movie, or a game, any kind of visual media, having aspects that you find compelling is what appeal is. That's all I got on appeal. I'm about done. So that's all the 12 principles. We're hiring. Can I do this? I'm doing it. We put up a job posting today. We are looking for 2D contract game animators for our game Indivisible. You can find more info at Lab Zero Games. We have a link to an animation test that you can download and take and send back to us. We actually generally care more about your test results than we care about your reels, but having both is always better. So I think that's it there. That's it. So if you're new to animating at all, if you're an animator who's new to games, hopefully this helped a little bit. If you're an experienced animator, I hope this helped you kind of remember where you started. The Illusion of Life, and also I had a couple examples from The Animator Survival Kit by Richard Williams. They're both great books that I think are essential reading for any animator. Do we still have time? Am I taking questions? Sure, let's take a few questions.
First question, how exactly do smears work?
Smears.
Basic brownie asks, how exactly do smears work?
So smears are interesting. Oh, do I have to repeat it? Okay, so the question was, how do smears work? Smears, the purpose of smears is to convey, like if you have a fast motion, if you just have two frames next to each other of that motion happening, but they cover a very large distance, it's going to look choppy if you just play those two frames next to each other. So what you do is you add a smear frame, which blends that motion. And the way you approach them, you can kind of do them in different ways. I wish I had examples. I don't know how to talk about smears without showing them. But you can either like stretch out the drawing, you can kind of do like a motion blur thing. I don't know if you guys have seen Captain America from Marvel vs. Capcom. His shield, they do smears by actually like copy pasting the shield like multiple times to recreate that motion. There's lots of different ways to approach smears, and I think it just depends on what you're going for. I don't know if that answers that, but it's really hard to talk about smears without showing some examples. Oh, am I wrapping up or?